all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe. From character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods, we will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I am one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup, and I am joined by my wonderful co-host.
Hey, I'm Shelby or Shecup.
So we are launching our next season, our 8th season, which... No, we have not been doing this for 8 years, but we are starting our season 8, which is going to be all focused on the lovely, lovely books of the Dragon Age series. And you may have seen our tweet post on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. Katie from the Split the Veil podcast had talked about the importance of the extra material in the Dragon Age universe leading up to Dreadwolf. And so we are here to kind of dissect that for you. We will read all the books. We will give kind of analysis and all of that about these books. So if you don't feel like you have time to read up on all this lore, but you want to get the most out of Dragon Age Dreadwolf, that is what this season is for, to fill you up on these books. And so basically this episode will be a lot different in format from what we would normally do. Normally, Shelby has done the research and is reading research points, and I'm offering sometimes wanted, sometimes unwanted commentary on said lore points. And that's the format. This is going to be a little different. This is basically a book club. We'll be talking about all the tie-in media, which means all books, comics, and short stories. And then in the second half of the season, we'll have something different, and Shelby's going to explain that for us.
Yes. So the first half of the season, like Austin has already explained, total book club. We're looking at every single piece of tie-in media that's canon. I think there are some extra comics that we're not going to cover because they're really hard to get your hands on. They're not canon and they're not really good. So we're not looking at those, but all the other stuff we are. But for the second half of the season, we're going to be talking about all the entertainment of Thedas. You know, books, literature, and entertainment, they all go hand in hand. And so it's kind of Entertainment of Thedas is this season's theme. So we're going to be covering things like Wicked Grace and sports and literature and theater and holidays and music and all these kinds of things in the second half. So that's what season 8 is going to look like.
Yeah. We're really excited for this season. It's going to be a lot of fun. And it helps me because I've been saying, I'm going to read all this material. I'll get to it someday or whatever. Well, someday is now because I will be reading most of this for the first time.
Yes. I mean, I know that you have started Stolen Throne and The Calling in the past multiple times. But other than those two, have you read any of the other materials?
I have read Asunder.
Okay.
Before.
You've actually finished that one?
Yes. I have started The Silent Grove. I have read all of the Fenris comics.
Okay. So you have read quite a bit, to be fair. So, okay, let's just dive right into our book club. So basically the way this is going to work is I'll give some background information about the book. We'll talk about the plot, and then we'll take a mid-break, do some character spotlights, and then analysis and rating in the second half. Background information about The Stolen Throne, because that's the one we're looking at today. So this was written by David Gaider, and it was published in 2009, and it was released as a prequel to Dragon Age Origins. I couldn't quite find the exact publishing date. I found some publishing dates, but there were conflicting information, so I can't tell you exact, like, okay, this was released in September and then the game was released in October. I'm not entirely sure on the book side of things for that. So just take it. It was released as a prequel. That's, goes hand in hand. They were released right around the same time. And then lastly, this book takes place from 896 to 899 Blessed Age. And I think it's the only one of the tie-in media books that takes place outside of the Dragon Age. So that's something that makes it unique. But also, I will say, and we may get into this a little bit later, there is some discrepancies about the years that this takes place. So we'll get into that at the very end. So, are we ready to get into the plot?
I am ready.
Let's just dive right in. So let's start at the beginning, obviously, with the opening of the book. And the book opens in a very dramatic way with Merrick running basically for his life. His mother, the rebel queen, Moira Theron, has been betrayed by her supporters. The usurper King Megran of Orlais is currently sitting on the Ferelden throne. So Moira has been assassinated, and Merrick is escaping through the woods.
I will say that this is a pretty, like you said, a dramatic opening. It really literally begins with Run Merrick. But I will be honest with you, I find the prose of this book difficult to slog through for me a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the good things that I like about this section here, it's really about, I enjoy the inner thoughts of Merrick and his characterization. I know this is written as a prequel, but there are a lot of points in this book that I think point to them either knowing or intending this to be read after you have played the game.
Yes, I agree with that because they explain a lot of things. It gives background to a lot of, Logain's characterization, which we'll get into later. And I very much agree with that. But for me, the very first thing that sticks out to me the most, and this is on page 2 and 3, it's that from the beginning, Merrick says that he has absolutely no interest in being king. And at a time when it would be very, very easy to find meaning in ruling, he finds none. Not only is he uninterested in ruling from the get-go, he also proves that he will be bad at it because he's not a strategic thinker. And I do have a quote to back this up, and it says, as he frantically ran on, images kept swirling through Merrick's mind. Moments ago, he'd been shivering in the cold forest clearing, convinced that his presence at the clandestine meeting was more a formality than anything else. He had barely paid attention to the proceedings. His mother had informed him earlier that with the support of these new men, the rebellion would finally become a force. These men were willing to turn on their Orlesian masters, she said, and that made it an opportunity that she wasn't willing to pass up after so many years spent running and hiding and only picking what battles they could win. Merrick hadn't objected to the meeting, and the idea that it might be risky never even occurred to him. And then it goes on a little bit later and says, the rebellion had always been hers and never his. He himself had never even seen his grandfather's throne, never understood the power his family had possessed before the Orlesians invaded. He'd spent his entire 18 years in rebel camps and remote castles, endlessly marching and forever being dragged along in his mother's wake. He couldn't even imagine what it might be like to not live that way. It was a completely foreign concept to him. And I think this is really important because it very much sets the stage for Merrick's wrestling with his role as the prince and now the king.
Yeah, and I think even further, one of my quotes that I had for this, even further along, was he was the king. It was ridiculous, of course. Him, the one who elicited so many impatient sighs and worried looks, the one for whom Mother always had to make excuses. She had always assured him that once he got older, he would grow into the same easy authority that she evinced. But that had never happened. It was no great offense either, as he had never taken seriously the idea that his mother might actually die. I think if you replace Merrick with the name Alistair, it completely it's one and the same. And I think that's intentional. I think there's some mirroring there. They want that parallel drawn of like, oh, this is Alistair's father. Like, this makes sense.
Yeah, and I actually think that the way that Merrick is written as a character is so well done because he reflects both Alistair and Kaelin both so much. And so I think that it's really well done on that front too.
He kills his first person here. Like, this is the first time. And he screams, like, you killed her, you bastard, you killed her. And it's a very violent, like, death. Like, he doesn't have a sword, he doesn't have a weapon of anything. He is killing this man with his bare hands.
Well, and a tree root. He is literally only has the stuff around him that he can use.
In the end, we have a final thought. Near the end, he says, "You're the king." He reminds himself. And I think it's so interesting and intentional that the phrase is, "You're the king," not "I am the king."
Yeah, because and it very much emphasizes that he is reminding himself, like he's freaking out, like he is reminding himself of this because he can't believe it either. Okay, so the next plot point is just after this. Merrick is being rescued by Logain MacTier, who brings Merrick to Logain's father's camp. They are kind of like bandit poachers on the run, makeshift housing, like very much nomadic. Logain takes Merrick to this camp. He's there for a little bit, and then they know that the usurper's forces, his soldiers, are going to arrive at the camp. And so when they are arriving, Logain and Merrick escape through the Korkari wilds, where they are met with wolves, elves, and the Woman of Many Years, also known as Flemeth. They eventually escape the wilds and meet up with what's left of the rebel army. So I have a lot of stuff on this one. And the first thing that I have of note is it's so funny to me that this is happening near Lothering. And Logain's family, his dad's camp, is near Lothering. It's in the South Hills, and it's very close to Lothering. And I'm just kind of like, how many people are coming out of this one small town? Like, Lothering is not a bustling metropolis. Like, it is a small town. But we have the Hawk siblings. The hero of Ferelden has very important life moments there, and Logain too. Like, these are like 4 or 5 very, very important people to the existence of Thedas that have all come out of or been informed by this one small town.
Yeah, I think that one of the things with Lothering that I think we don't really get to see in Dragon Age Origins is that, like, it is really at a crossroads. It's really like the only point that we get to know about that's between like Redcliffe and the Korkaki Wilds. So I'm sure it actually does get a lot of trade.
That's probably fair. But still. Okay, so Logain and Merrick finally get acquainted on page 27 in the book, which, it's not that far into it, but it's not like, page 1 or anything. We get it from Logain's perspective, and the book says, "It was a young man, Logain's age or perhaps younger. His fair hair and fairer skin were obscured under scratches, leaves, dirt, and a healthy dose of blood. He certainly wasn't dressed for a run in the woods, wearing only a tattered shirt and enough mud to make one think he'd escaped whoever he was running from by crawling around on his belly. The blood covered his face as well as his hands. Probably not all his. Whoever this man was, he had likely killed to get away, which told Logain just how desperate the intruder might be. The new arrival crouched before them in the shadows like a caught animal, frozen between flight and fight." So the thing that I think is significant about this is the last sentence. The new arrival, Merrick, is being portrayed as basically like doe-eyed, frightened animal. And I think it's interesting because Merrick is the one that's depicted as desperate, alone, hunted, whereas Logain is the opposite of that. Logain is the hunter. Logain is the one that's on the high ground, whereas in reality, Merrick is the one that has power in the world. Merrick is the one that has connections to get ahead, whereas Logain has nothing. He's oppressed. He is living in this band of criminals, basically. And yet, Logain looks at Merrick as if Merrick is a frightened animal. And my question is, do you think Logain ever stops seeing Merrick in this light?
That's a good question. I think that Logain, at least, and we'll talk about this in other points, I think that he definitely respects Merrick by the end of it. And I think that he definitely cares for Merrick. But I think that, like, maybe not doe-eyed would be the word that I would use, but I would say Logain never stops viewing Merrick as someone who has to be, like, cautioned, as someone who has to be pulled back, who's someone who has to be told, hey, like, stop being stupid.
Yeah.
Logain never views Merrick as someone who is not that, who knows what decision needed to be made and is willing to make the hard decision. I think that is one thing that Logain probably never really gets over, is that he doesn't think Merrick is capable of making the hard decision unless being pushed.
And I think I would tend to agree with Logain on that front. And I also think maybe it's fair to say that Logain never really truly sees Merrick as his equal.
And we'll see this tension in a couple of points, but Logain doesn't view any noble thing of birth, meaning that anyone is better than him.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And it's very much a Ferelden point of view, is he doesn't view nobility and having it being born into a title as making you better than anybody else because of it. And I think that's very Ferelden of him. And I don't necessarily think most of the other characters do think that, but Logain, I think, just takes it to an extreme, which kind of is in his character, which we'll see.
Right.
So they go on into the camp. Do you have thoughts? We can talk about Gareth, Mother Eyeless. They're two semi-important characters. We're not really going to talk about them in depth in our character spotlight, but they are important in this narrative arc of the book. Gareth is Logain's father, who kind of is the commander of this group that they travel with. And then Mother Eyeless is a chantry sister who also travels with them and, provides chantry services, healing, etc., education.
I just want to say that the budding romance between Gareth and the sister is so sweet. Logain reflects on this relationship and is like, hey, yeah, they would have totally boned.
That's fair. I'll give you that. Okay, so let's talk about when Merrick gets to the camp, because he is kind of walking into this camp expecting one thing and is greeted with a completely different thing. And the book even says he had expected maybe a handful of outlaws, but here was an entire community hidden in the cliffs. And he even goes on to talk about how when he meets Gareth, Logain's father, he goes on to talk about how he's seen commanders before. He has seen leaders in the military, and Gareth is a leader. Gareth is an ethical person. Gareth is an upstanding man full of honor, and he wasn't expecting to find that here.
Gareth really serves for Merrick's first kingly act, which we'll get to, which I think is really important with Logain. Logain kind of uses the fact that his father is knighted by Merrick as you're not going to win me over.
The situation is pretty much as soon as the usurper King Megren's forces are closing in on them, Merrick knights Gareth, Logain's father, and basically is like, you're going to fight in my stead. And they leave, and Logain's kind of pissy about it because Logain thinks that Merrick just did it to buy Logain's allegiance. But I don't think that's why Merrick did it. I think Merrick did it because he felt like Gareth deserved to be a knight, because he felt like Gareth was an upstanding man that, had the circumstances been different, he could have gotten to join the rebel forces.
I definitely agree with that. And I also think that it's an important moment. Merrick doesn't a lot of times in these stories, we get a point of the heir apparent comes in and is oh yes, I'm ready to be king and seize this authority, and then I'm arrogant and I make mistakes and do that. I think Merrick is really the opposite of that trope, where he is a reluctant ruler, and he very gradually takes steps into assuming the authority of the king. And knighting Gareth is the first step that he takes.
Yes, very much. And I was just going to say that because it is the very first time we've seen him act in a kingly way thus far in the book. And this happens on page 57. So it's taken almost 60 pages for him to act anything resembling nobility.
And then in the next like 10 pages, we're going to get all of that. We're back to the doe-eyed kid.
Yeah, for sure. And I just wanted to go back a little bit because there's something important that we've skipped over with Logain. And I think we are focusing on Merrick's characterization, obviously, because he's the king, but we get little glimpses of Logain also in this chapter. We get some glimpses of him being pretty racist to an elf who's in their group. He basically says something like, all elves, they don't work. They just want to laze around kind of situation with this elf named Potter. But we also see when Merrick and Gareth and Logain are first talking, the first meeting they have before the knighting, Merrick is not entirely truthful. He is telling some of the truth, but not the entire truth. And Logain starts shouting at Merrick and is like, he's lying. Logain seethed. He drew his belt knife and stepped forward menacingly. The crowd of onlookers murmured excitedly in response, smelling blood. Let me kill him, father. This is my fault. I never should have brought him here. Gareth's expression was unchanged. He's not lying. I bring this up because I think that it points to a really important character aspect of Logain, which we'll talk about later, but it's his brutality. He is brutal. When Logain has decided something, you cannot convince him otherwise, regardless of if it's the truth or not. And Logain is always, always willing to go to the extreme for whatever decision he's made. And that can be a really good thing, especially in war, but it can also be a really dangerous thing. And so, this happens on page 42. And it's early in the book, and I think that this character plot point is very minor, but it sets the stage for who we know Logain will be later in life.
I totally agree. And I think that it's also, there are a couple things that like Logain's like points of no return for him, I feel like, are dishonesty. And this really is lumped in with dishonesty as well, but not honoring those who have been loyal to you.
And also at the same time, flip side of that, not holding accountable those who have been disloyal to you.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of this chapter that we're talking about, he watches his father die. He's already seen his mother die. He doesn't really have many other people in the world other than Merrick and later on Rowan and maybe some of the other people that he's fought alongside in the war. So it's kind of like he doesn't have that many people in his life.
But I really think that like this is what attracts Merrick and Logain to a friendship. First of all, it's that they are both surrounded by people, but they are also entirely alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they really only have each other. Okay, so really quickly, let's talk about the wilds. They escape into the Korkari wilds and find a lot of troubles. Basically, what happens is they make camp and get captured by some elves who take them to Flemeth. And I think that is kind of the biggest thing to talk about. Merrick and Logain have a big fight about Gareth too. But skipping forward a little bit to when they get captured by the elves, I want to call this out because we know that Logain is extremely racist to the elves in Dragon Age Origins. He allows them to get sold into slavery, concocts this whole scheme in the alienage, etc. But we see this elven racism really early on page 72, when they get captured by the elves. Logain thinks he could hear a roaring fire nearby, a large one, and before his eyes opened, he could tell he was seated against some kind of pole with his arms tied together behind it. Was he going to be cooked then? Roasted on a skewer over a roaring fire? Was that something that the elves did? So it's just kind of like, no, this isn't the worst thing he could think. But he clearly, this coupled with the remarks about Potter earlier in the book, is like, okay, well, I can see the seeds of how this racism, this fear even of this group of people can manifest into something greater, which is ironic and frankly heartbreaking given his later involvement with the night elves, his own battalion, but we'll talk about that when we get there.
And then we get to Flemeth or the woman of many years. One thing I appreciate about this is like Flemeth's characterization in this is still almost exactly as her characterization in Dragon Age Origins. Old woman who is snarky and says one thing but means another. I know you have a little thing that you asked me one time when you were reading. You were like, would you describe Flemeth as decrepit?
I wouldn't. I mean, I think she's old, obviously, but it literally on page 79 says a decrepit woman hobbled into view from among the trees. I wouldn't classify her that way, but it's funny.
Well, definitely. I think that Dragon Age Origins Flemeth definitely does look like more older and like maybe a little more frail.
Mm-hmm.
Dragon Age 2 and Dragon Age Inquisition Flemeth, no, that woman could step on your neck and break it.
Let's talk about the scenes with Flemeth. Basically, what happens in a little bit of a summary is Logain does not even want to speak to her, is antagonistic every time she says anything. Merrick is more open. And so some of the quotes, I'm going to read a few quotes here. These are not necessarily like back to back to back. There's a little bit of space. But anyway, so the first one on page 81 starts with Flemeth. So you are he, the witch said, nodding with approval as she studied Merrick. I knew you would come, and the manner in which you would come, but not the when. She let out a sharp guffaw and slapped her knees. Isn't it marvelous how very capricious magic can be with its information? It's like asking a cat for directions. Consider yourself lucky if it only tells you where to go. She howled with laughter at her own joke. Both Merrick and Logain stared at her blankly. Her laughter slowly quieted into a sigh. Well, what did you think, she asked? That the king of Ferelden could pass through the Korhari wilds and it would go completely without notice? And then later on, they keep talking about random stuff, who she is. And then finally, Merrick says, then what do you want with me? She bit into her apple with a loud crunch and chewed it thoughtfully as she sat back in her rocking chair. Why does anyone desire an audience with their sovereign? You want something from me? He shrugged helplessly. You probably would have been better off with my mother if that's the case. I don't have much of anything. Fortunes change. The witch's gaze shifted to far off in the distance. 1 minute you're in love, so much in love that you can't imagine anything wrong ever happening. And the next, you're betrayed. Your love has been ripped from you like your own leg, and you'd swear you'd do anything to make those responsible pay. Her eyes focused on Merrick, and her voice became soft, caressing. Sometimes vengeance changes the world. What will yours do, young man? He said nothing, staring at her uncertainly. Logain stepped forward angrily. Leave him alone. The witch turned to regard him, her eyes delighted. And what of yours? You've rage enough inside you, tempered into a blade of fine steel. Into whose heart will you plunge that one day, I wonder? Merrick and I are not friends, he growled, but I don't want him dead.
I just think like there's so much, any interaction with Flemeth, there's so much.
Yeah.
But like the part of this that really like got me just like having the knowledge of the greater Dragon Age universe in this. I don't know how much of this is intentional, but the line vengeance can change the world is chilling given the rest of Thedas is like the rest of the Dragon Age.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. And like she even goes on to mention Logain directly again. She says to Merrick about Logain, keep him close and he will betray you each time worse than the last. And so Merrick basically is like, I'm not impressed. I don't believe you, whatever. At the end of this chapter, Flemeth says, I've snatched you up from the brink of the proverbial pit, she continued, and I'm going to send you back out into the world, safe and sound. The witch reclined in her chair then, looking very much pleased with herself. And what do you want in exchange for this help? Logain demanded. A promise, she smiled. Made by the king to me in private and then never spoken of again to anyone. And we still don't know what this promise is. There are many guesses, but to be fair, we do not actually have canon confirmation.
Right. I think the prevailing theory is what I think is probably right, which are the events that happen with Flemeth's other daughter. It's probably something to do with the promise that he made Flemeth.
Yeah, I think it's that or the blight. There's really no other things that make much sense, but those are my thoughts. Okay, so after they meet with Flemeth, she helps them get out of the wilds, and they meet Rowan. They meet up with the rest of the rebel army, but I wanted to read a little bit of Rowan's introduction. Basically, what happens is a few knights come up on Logain and Merrick. They're about to fight them, and then the main knight, which is Rowan, realizes that it's Merrick. The part that I wanted to read is just after that, and it says, Merrick looked distinctly discomfited. Hello? He finally said. It's good to see you. She remained silent, her mouth thinning into an angry frown. Aren't you happy to see me at all? He asked. She punched him. Her gauntleted fist, slamming into Merrick's jaw, sent him sprawling onto his back. Lifting a curious brow, Logain watched Merrick lie there, groaning and clutching his face, and then turned back to regard the female knight. She was furious now, her look daring him to go ahead and defend Merrick. He sheathed his sword. Yes, you definitely know him. And I just think this introduction is fascinating because, number one, I love Rowan. But number two, it's establishing so many thematic, narrative, literary similarities between Logain and Rowan's characters.
Yes, I do think that is very poignant in her introduction. And I think there's an intentionality of that they are two sides of the same coin. The difference between Rowan and Logain is very much that Logain is a survivor, and I think that Rowan is a fighter.
So after Rowan's introduction, he goes back to the army. Shale makes an appearance, etc. Things happen. But right after this, 3 years pass. And so Logain, Rowan, Merrick, they all spend time with the rebel army, making a name for themselves, fighting, trying to build up this rebel army. And they do this in several different ways. We get Logain taking leadership with his own company, the Night Elves. And this is a company, basically, it's very self-explanatory. It's a company of elves primarily. They go out in the nighttime. They're all archers, and they take down their enemies. And they get a very renowned reputation, so much so that the book says that some of the Orlesian patrols refused to go out at night because they were so terrified of the night elves. And this is Logain's invention. It really gets him his own renown. And then Rowan and Merrick, they just continue what they had been doing. Merrick especially working with Rowan's father, Rendorn, Garen, to create battle strategies. And he's not very good at that. And he feels very insecure about Rendorn not taking him seriously, but he's very much trying to prove himself. But something I want to bring up is during this time period, there are several times that we get references to Logain being a commoner and being looked down upon because he's a commoner. I'm just curious if you think this tracks with Ferelden lore. To me, this is much more Orlesian in nature. It could also be Logain's his own insecurity, or even just an unintentional side effect that occurred during the Orlesian occupation. But I feel like this is decidedly not a Ferelden consideration whatsoever.
I think when you have a system, a caste of nobility, there's always going to be disdain between the nobility and for commoners, the common folk. I mean, even just like look at the disparity in the US between what we call the 1% or the 99%. One thing that I think is different about Ferelden nobility versus Orlesian nobility is Ferelden nobility at least like attempts to care about the common people. Orlesian nobility does not. This is like a big moment for me where I think like established Loghain and like made me like Loghain. And it's the whole argument they have about Merrick leaving the camp and the rebels staying and fighting. And Merrick's like, no, I'm not going to let more people die. And Allrindern is just like, no, you have to. Like, this is, and they go back and forth. And the Arl is basically like, don't be stubborn. There's no point in fighting just to lose. And then Loghain says, then win. In this moment, as a commoner, is basically like, you're playing on their terms. Stop playing on their terms.
Yeah, and also I think he has a similar quote in here too where he's like, you have advantages you haven't even thought of. You have advantages you haven't even considered. Why are you willing to give up and throw in the towel already? And Rowan and Rendorn, her father, are basically like, well, we can build up the army again, like it'll be okay. And Merrick and Loghain are both unwilling to give up the progress they've made so far. And I think that that's honorable.
A lot of times rebel alliances in these stories, they win because of the audacity of the things that they want to do, that they're so out there, they're so far-fetched that the enemy has no idea what to plan for or whatever. I mean, like, take a great example is the attack on the first Death Star. Like, none of the Empire ever thought that they would get a bomb into the exhaust port.
But they did.
They said, screw it, we're going to do it anyway. Same thing here with Loghain. Like, we're going to do this. If you can't afford to lose, then win.
Right. And like, this is the first battle that we're talking about now that the rebel army really has faced in a long time. Loghain's audacity is really on full display because it's his idea. It's his strategy that they follow of Loghain pretending to be Merrick and drawing these Chevalier away from the main fighting. And it succeeds. It's bloody. Rendorn is willing to sacrifice Loghain entirely. Rowan disobeys him to go after Loghain. And so he obviously lives, but it is audacious. It is risky. It is not the safe plan, but it works.
I think Loghain really establishes himself here as a hero of the people, which I think makes what could happen at the Landsmeet if you don't get enough support, especially Anora's support, more plausible. That like,
yeah,
especially when Anora recalls the hero of River Dane, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But like, this is the start of that. Loghain is the one who saves the rebellion. Yes, Merrick is there and he is their hope, but Loghain is the one who saved them in reality.
Yes. And so something I want to talk about a little bit on that topic is the end of this battle when Loghain, Merrick, Rowan, and Arl Rendorn are all reunited. It's after the battle, and this is what the book says. So this is page 130 and 131. The Arl limped up to Loghain and shook his hand as well. I misjudged you. You clearly have excellent instincts, and we could use your assistance. Loghain's blue eyes shifted among the Arl and Merrick and Rowan, and for a moment, Merrick thought he looked almost trapped. He glanced down at the fire and stared at it for a time before reluctantly nodding. I very well. I'll stay. For now. Pleased, Merrick turned at last to Rowan. Even bruised and battered, she looked radiant. It was just her way. She brightened as he took her hands in his. When you hadn't charged, I thought perhaps we'd lost you, he said seriously. Don't scare me like that again. Her eyes teared, though she grinned and laughed. You don't get out of it that easily, Merrick. Funny, he answered wryly. Loghain looked up from the fire, nonplussed. Get out of what? He asked the Arl. Merrick and Rowan are betrothed. Arl Rendorn smiled. She was promised to him when she was born. Ah, Loghain said simply, and returned his gaze to the fire. End quote. The reason I think this is significant, obviously the romantic aspect of this trio and later quartet will be significant, but I think this is the first real like trio moment we have with the three of them, even though Rendorn is tagging along. But I just think it's interesting that like this is their first real bonding moment. And yet it's colored by the revelation that Merrick and Rowan are to be married.
Right.
The next chapter really starts with the opposite point of view with Megren and Severin, his advisor. We do get a few more moments viewing the story through the eyes of the usurper king, although they are fewer than through the eyes of Merrick, Logain, and Rowan. But something I wanted to bring up, this is so random, but it's about the Orlesian Chevalier in this chapter. And it basically talks about their appearance. And there are Orlesian Chevalier, the elite knights of the empire, easily distinguished by their bright purple tunics and feathered hats. So to me, I'm like, this is a lore inconsistency because we've always seen them wearing gold armor, not purple tunics like Gale in Baldur's Gate 3.
I think it's probably just a lore inconsistency that like when they were presenting chevaliers in Inquisition and in Dragon Age 2 that they changed that. But I wonder if like the purple tunic choice was like to shed light on like the opposing forces between Ferelden and Orlais, and that like Merrick is normally like designated by a purple tunic. Well, the Chevaliers, or a purple cloak, Chevaliers with their purple tunic, they're saying like, you're no better than us. Like, you're at the same level we are.
Yeah, I could see that. And I mean, the Chevalier, you have to be a part of the nobility in Orlais to be part of them anyway. But I actually looked this up because I thought the same as you, that, they just changed it after Origins. Well, actually, you can find an armor set in Origins that is Chevalier armor. It's for a warrior, and it is the gold-plated whole business. So, I don't know.
I think that David Gaider got a lot of like editor-free license with this book, mainly given that like we haven't talked about this, but like someone talks about Andraste dying on a cross instead of being burnt at the stake. But
yeah.
So
yeah, and there are a lot of those things, which we'll talk about at the very end of the episode. But I just think, books have to be written well before the game can be released, so they can be published and distributed and all that. And so, there's going to be little lore things. But back to this chapter, this is where we meet Megren for the first time. He's portrayed as power hungry. He's portrayed as very fickle, stupid, obsessed with himself, and he has two advisors, Mother Bronach, a sister of the Chantry, and Severin, a mage who is also power hungry. In this chapter, we also meet Catriel for the first time, who becomes a main character, and she is in the employ of Severin and, of course, Megren as well. And so Severin has hired her as a spy to spy on and ultimately betray Merrick.
Megren was exactly what I expected him to be. The tyrant, very reminiscent of like the King John, Prince John, like from the Robin Hood stories, like very reminiscent of that kind of characterization of, I want my money, I want nothing to do with it. He became public enemy number one for me when he started shitting on the Mobaris.
Yes. Oh, yeah, for sure. I hated him from the get-go. He's so brutal, too, but in a completely different way than Logain. But just moving forward a little bit, basically, Catriel is sent to get in with Rowan, Merrick, and Logain. She does this, and Merrick, she's being, like, assaulted. We're not really sure if it's fake or real, but Merrick, of course, wants to play the good guy and save her, and it's right during the first battle of Glorin, and all of this stuff is kind of happening all at the same time. But I wanted to bring up something that happens at the same time, or maybe just a little bit before this, and it's where Rowan and Logain are being sent out to gain support from the other bands in Ferelden. The reason I want to read this is because it very much illustrates the fact that Rowan and Logain are far too similar for them to ever work as a couple. Because throughout the book and at the very end, close to the end, they do enter into a romantic relationship, but it is always destined to fail. And it says, Rowan and Logain rode out first, though their pairing naturally didn't come without argument. Neither of them was inclined to leave Merrick's side, nor did they particularly relish the idea of traveling together. But in the end, Merrick's insistence won out. And then it says later, Rowan found herself impressed by Logain's ability to quickly assess whether a band was legitimately interested or just eager to gain favor with the king by trying to trap them. Once she had become infuriated with Logain as he pulled her away from a dinner table without explanation, only to belatedly realize that guards had been quietly maneuvering in the shadows. He had seen it coming, not her. Blades were bared, and the two of them were forced to fight back to back in order to escape capture. In such situations, Logain never once treated her as if she required saving or any sort of special protection. He expected her sword arm to be as strong as his own, and she made sure it was.
Logain is always looking for betrayal. Like, it's not that he just has a sense to know it. It's that he's always looking. That's his secret. He's always expecting betrayal.
He's vigilant. He's vigilant in everything. But I have another little moment that I want to read from this timeline, this time period, because I think that this passage, it speaks to Rowan and Logain's little fling that's starting. But I think that this scene where I'm fixing to read is where David Gaider excels at writing. It says, Rowan glanced across the fire then and realized that Logain was staring at her. He said nothing, and the intensity in those icy blue eyes made her heart skip. She looked away quickly, wrapping the blanket around her more tightly as she shuddered. How long had he been staring at her so quietly? I haven't thanked you, he stated. She looked up, confused. Thanked me? Back at the battle, you rode to my rescue. He smiled grimly, quite literally, in fact. There's no need to— There is. He cut her off. She watched with fascination as he took a deep breath and then stared straight into her eyes as if he wanted to be certain she understood his sincerity. I know what you did, and I'm grateful. I should have told you so before. The cold went away. And I just think that last line, the cold went away, it just is like so perfect to me because it's this tiny sentence that truly illustrates the depth of the infatuation that Rowan has with Logain. And it's 4 words, but it's excellent. It's not about the actual temperature outside. It's not about that at all.
Because Logain at this point has been described as cold and uncaring and calculating and brutal and all of that. And then it's Rowan who says the cold went away, which she's talking about Logain's personality.
Right. Logain's personality and how she feels about him too. And, you know, in a few pages after this, it even says, outside of the Night Elves, Logain was regarded as a taciturn and even unfriendly man. So, yeah, everybody thinks he's that way. But Merrick and Rowan don't. They see differently. Okay, so after the Battle of Guaran, right in this timeline, they are able to take the town, and they're not sure if they can hold it, but they're trying to. They're doing everything they can. The rebel army has been built up a little bit, and they're looking forward to their next attack. And Catriel has come into the picture. She feels indebted to Merrick, and so she's kind of hanging around, and she gives him intel that there is the Chevalier forces. There's new Chevaliers coming in from Orlais. They're going to be going through the town of West Hill, and they're going to be carrying a butt ton of money. That's going to be basically the Chevalier's salary for the entire year, and it's going to Megran. And so she gives them this information, and they start planning a battle. It ends up being a humiliating defeat, obviously, because she planned it that way, because she's a spy for Megran. She's a bard from Orlais. Like, she knows how this works. It's a humiliating defeat from the rebels. Arl Rendorn dies. Like, they lose a ton of people. It's horrible. Merrick, Catriel, Rowan, and Logain are barely able to escape the usurper's troops, and they want to get back to Guaran immediately. They want to get back to their home base as soon as they possibly can. And they are so far away from that. No matter where they go, there are troops surrounding them. And so it's Catriel's idea to go into the deep roads.
Catriel and her relationship with Merrick. One, elf women will always be Merrick's weakness. It is his kryptonite. But also, I think it's interesting to me. It's in these scenes that are in there with Catriel and them in the deep roads and between Rowan and Merrick, where Logain and Rowan are basically just like, this is suspicious. Merrick's like, nah, she like, I like her. Rowan is basically looks at Merrick and is like, are you sure you're being clear about this? And it's like this understanding that she knows what he's been doing. And I lost a lot of respect for Merrick in this because it's very clear that Merrick understands the hurt that he delivered Rowan by doing this. And he does offer to stop. But when Rowan says, no, I don't want you to stop, I think it's a moment of Merrick not being able to like read the room of Rowan doesn't want him to stop because he thinks she wants him to stop. She wants him to stop because he wants to stop. And then it's after this, like once Rowan has established like there will be no romantic feelings with Merrick, it is then that she goes to Logain.
But at the same time, she also says the same thing to Logain because, I mean, it says, Logain says, I am not a fool, he said quietly. I see how you look at him. You do. Her tone was bitter. I know you are promised to him. I know you are to become queen. He stepped toward her, taking her cold hands in his. She looked away from him, grimacing, and it only made him look at her sadly. I have known these things since I first met you. For 3 years, I have tried to accept that this is how it must be, and yet, still, I can't stop thinking of you. Stop, she hissed, pulling her hands away. Logain stared at her, his eyes tortured, but she couldn't care, couldn't. Angry tears streamed down her cheeks as she backed away from him. For the love of the Maker, don't do this, she begged. Logain's stricken look twisted up her insides all the more. She clamped down on her anguish and turned away. Just leave me alone. Whatever you thought, whatever you wanted from me. She wiped at her eyes and found herself wishing again that she was in her armor instead of that flimsy, useless dress. I cannot, I will not be that woman. Her tone was brusque and final. Rowan fled, her back stiff and the train of her red dress trailing behind her. She didn't look back.
Rowan is not willing to betray Merrick until she realizes that, like, he is not going to give the same respect to her.
Right, and I think that Rowan always thought that they would grow into love, that they would fall in love eventually, that yes, we're promised to each other, things might happen, we're not interested, we're not more than friends right now, but one day we will be. One day when we get married, we're going to be in love and we're going to have children and we're going to rule Ferelden and we're going to have this idyllic life. And I'm not sure Merrick has ever even thought about the day that comes when he actually sits on Ferelden's throne for real, what that will look like. I don't think Merrick can barely think about 3 months in the future, much less years in the future when he's ruling.
And I think part of that is survival, that Merrick doesn't want to think about him ruling because he doesn't want to assume that he will rule. I do think that Merrick loves Rowan.
I do think he does. Yes.
Just maybe not romantically in that sense, in the way Rowan was hoping they would grow.
I agree with that. I think he loves her deeply, but as a sister, as a friend.
So we're going to head to the mid-break before we go on and talk about the deep roads.
What is this? A new book? All this shit is weird. Oh, Varric, that is a terrible title. What are you even thinking?
That book you were reading this morning, Hessarian's Spear. I don't think he had a spear in the legends.
He does in this one. Read the description.
Andraste knelt before no man but her maker. But she hadn't counted on the Archon Hessarian. Can Hessarian penetrate the tight-knit defenses of the warrior prophetess? Will she be prepared to face the full blast of his power? Wait a minute. Isabella, this is a vulgar thing.
You want to borrow it?
No!
You sure? It has pictures.
Not listening, I'm not listening.
Varric, does Hawke ever autograph books?
Why? Doesn't your copy of The Tale of the Champion have a big hole in it?
Yes, but it could also have Hawke's signature on it.
So welcome to the middle of the show where we talk about all things going on with the podcast. And it's here where we thank our patrons. Thank you to our first patrons, Genesis and Lisa M. We also have a new patron, Hekarunis. Thank you so much for your support and thank you for signing up. We also have a review to read, which another great way to support us is to leave us ratings and reviews on Apple or Spotify. And so this review comes from Jean, who I understand is also our new patron. And this is on the Uthanera episode, so our latest episode. And says, I have finally caught up. I love this podcast. I have a great need for anything about Dragon Age as I can't get enough, and this podcast is absolutely the best for that. Well, thank you so much for your review and your support on Patreon. We greatly support it. You can also come and hang out with us on Discord, talk about Dragon Age, talk about Assassin's Creed, talk about Star Wars, talk about whatever you want in regards to gaming. You can come hang out with us. Have a great time at the Cups Podcasting and More Discord. And also, you can go to our website, cupspodcasting.com, and check out our merch store. We've got a lot of great merch there for Assassin's Creed, for Dragon Age. It is awesome. And I think that's all I have for the middle of the show.
All right, well, let's get back into it.
The past years have been so busy. We have earned at least a few moments of rest.
A calm night out sounds... Oh, bravo! Bravo!
Was the woman in gold playing a king? Who was the man in feathers?
Oh, it's all very simple. The first actor's mask is determined by... well, I will lend you the program guide. But tell me, did you enjoy the performance?
That was one of the greatest things I've ever seen.
Truly.
That part with the glittery, and they actually set fire to... Yes, I truly enjoyed it.
Then I call tonight a great success.
I've got some of it written down now.
Give it here. Her breasts strained against the leather jerkin like two wild stallions corralled against their will. She pounced, the smooth moves of a jungle cat, and locked her thighs around Donnick's waist. He...
What?
Nothing. What is that?
Shh.
Isabella just thought she'd celebrate your love affair with a written dedication.
It's friend fiction. I do it out of love.
I will never, ever be clean again.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
So let's talk about the Deep Roads.
There's a lot of stuff that happens, but there's really only three things of note. First, they go through Ortantig, which nobody's seen for forever because there's a bunch of deadly blight spiders there. They fight the blight spiders off, whatever. And then they get attacked by Darkspawn, which leads to the second main thing that happens, which is that the Legion of the Dead appears, led by a man named Nauther, who is one of my favorite characters in this book. And they talk. The dwarves basically save them from these Darkspawn and lead them to Gwarin. And we'll talk about the third thing in a minute. But basically what happens is that Nauther and the troops that he leads, they ally with Merrick and his group and say, yeah, we'll come help you fight people on the surface. They're afraid of the surface, of course, but they agree to do it. And they do. They follow them all the way back to Gwarin, which they've been going underground. And if they hadn't run into these dwarves, they definitely would have gotten lost, which leads me to the third thing that happens. And this happens right before they encounter the Legion of the Dead. The romantic relationships are starting to get messier. So things are getting messier. They're basically lost and they're arguing. Rowan, Merrick, and Logain are arguing about what they should do next. They've been injured. Merrick has gotten a special sword and Rowan and Logain go to Merrick and they put forth the plan. Maybe they should leave Catriel behind. Merrick is enraged and is pissed off and furious that they would even think about this and more so that they would they would talk about it amongst themselves and then go to Merrick with the plan. He's mad about all of it. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the dialogue here. And so it starts with Merrick saying, "Are you actually serious?" he asked, his shock slowly giving way to outrage. "Leave her because she's injured?" "No, it's not that," Rowan said firmly. She held up a hand to stop Logain from joining in. He frowned but complied. "Merrick, we don't think it's wise to trust her." "What are you saying?" "We're saying there's a lot of things that don't add up. You can't say this is the same woman we found screaming for help in Guarin." Logain nodded. "I was willing to accept her as a messenger, even one of Arl Byron's agents, but these skills she's shown, the knowledge she possesses, this is no simple elven servant, Merrick." Merrick stiffened, feeling his anger growing. "And even if she isn't, why is that a bad thing?" "Merrick," Logain said uneasily. "She came to my defense," Merrick insisted, "when she could have just as easily have helped those soldiers kill us. She's offered her knowledge freely when she could have just as easily have led us into the usurper's hands." His eyes narrowed. "What is it exactly that you think she's done?" "I don't know that she's done anything," Logain said truthfully. "All I know is that she makes me uneasy." Rowan took a deep breath. "Consider that you may not be very objective about her, Merrick," she stated evenly. Merrick paused, taken aback. And then he saw the hurt pride in Rowan's eyes. She was trying to hide it, but it was obvious even to him that she wanted to be anywhere other than here. She knows, he realized. It made sense now. The day before they had embarked at Guarin, the way she had looked at him so expectantly, and when he had asked her about it, she had stormed off. The anger, the slap. "Oh," he muttered, his anger quickly dissolving. He'd practiced 100 times how to tell Rowan about Catriel, and figured that when it happened, it would be like none of those times. He had wanted to tell her. He had wanted to say that Catriel made him feel capable. He didn't have to prove anything to her. But how would that sound? It wasn't that he felt the need to prove himself to Rowan. She had known him as a child. She knew his every fault and his every mistake better than he did. He loved Rowan. It was simply different. And it goes on. And this is what you were talking about earlier when Merrick is like, "I'll end it with Catriel," and Rowan is like, "No, I don't want you to do that because of me. What I want is for you to listen to what we're saying about her." And he doesn't, as you probably could have guessed, he doesn't. And what happens is Rowan and Logain sleep together in the deep roads, which I find disgusting, but whatever. And also in this moment, Catriel tries to tell Logain the truth. She starts telling him, like, "Hey, I'm not who you think I am. Like, I'm not honorable. I'm not." And Merrick is like, no, you're my elf bae girlfriend. And she's like, "Okay, but I'm not that." And it's just really messy.
And there's a line in here, I don't remember if it's later or here, but where Merrick is basically like, "I love Catriel because Catriel doesn't see the fumbling boy. She sees the king and the hero."
Yeah.
Which kind of like, when I read it, I understand it from Merrick's point of view, at least, but it kind of made me throw up a little bit because he was like, basically, "I love her because she worships me," is how it came across to me.
I see that. I don't think it's intended that way. I think it's because I think so much of this book so far has been us shining a freaking spotlight on Merrick's flaws and failures that finally we have a character who doesn't see those. And so I don't necessarily think it's gross, although I definitely understand that interpretation for sure. For sure get that. And later on, I think Logain brings it up to Merrick, like, how can you... Do you really think you can sit on the throne with an elf as your wife? Like, do you really think that that's what's going to happen? And Merrick's like, "I don't know, maybe." And it's like, no, this would never have worked out. And on page 300, Merrick and Catriel they have this huge argument about the role of elves and dwarves, dwarven castlists. And she's telling this story about how it's said that when they all went to Orzammar as the capital, like, they left behind all the castlists. And Merrick is like, "Oh my God, that's terrible. We would never do that." And Catriel is like, "Bruh, really? Like, do you really think that you wouldn't do that? Look at the way you treat elves. Like, do you think anybody would go out of their way to make sure the elves in the alienage was safe if we have to leave Denerim?" And he's like, "Yeah, I would." And she's like, sure, you would, buddy. Okay, we'll see. So, like, even now, there are these huge fault lines that they would have never been able to get past if it wasn't for all of the other, like, betrayal and spying and all that, too.
This is where I can tell that David Gaider is a video game writer because so much happens in the last 100 pages.
I do think it's a tendency of fantasy writers, too. I think this happens with Tolkien. This happens with Sarah J. Maas. This happens with a lot of fantasy books that I've read, and I've read a lot of fantasy. And I just think that there's this tendency to world build when you're setting out the beginning of your novel that you want to make sure people know all about your world, and I get that. But the last two, like even really the last second half of the book is jam-packed back to back to back. And the first time I read it, I could not comprehend what happens at the different battles. Like there's multiple battles of Gorin. There's some battles that aren't named. Like all of it was one big battle to me. Now I have it separate a little bit better, but like it all runs together.
I think an important point is that Nalthor and the Legion of the Dead pledged to fight for Merrick, which I think will be a big point of the Battle of Gweren and the Battle of the River Dane coming up. So obviously we're on to the next point, which is the big confrontation between Merrick and Catriel. So basically what happens is Catriel goes back to Severin and basically says, I'm not going to work for you anymore. F off, middle finger, you broke our contract. Goodbye. Well, Loghain and Rowan have her followed to Denerim, and they realize where she goes. And so Loghain goes back to Merrick and tells him that she went to Denerim, kind of intentionally leaving out a detail that there is now a price on her head. And so Merrick is obviously enraged. He comes and he confronts Catriel while Loghain is there, and Merrick kills her. In the heat of the moment, he kills her. Loghain and Merrick have this conversation, and Merrick's like, she betrayed you. This is what you have to do. This is when the doe-eyed Merrick dies. When he kills Catriel, the hopeful, the forgiving, the world is going to be okay, Merrick dies. If you want to use our video game terms, this is Merrick's hardening moment. This is when you've made the choice and you now have hardened Merrick, which I think is really relevant in the next thing he does.
Because I think I want to read part of the dialogue here between Merrick and Loghain before he kills her. And Loghain is trying to convince Merrick of her guilt, basically. And Merrick is like, why is everyone so set on telling me what decisions I have to make? How am I ever going to be a king if I don't make any of my own decisions? And Loghain says, you think this is a kingly decision, do you? Why not? Merrick asked acidly. Suddenly you're an expert on being a king? Then he immediately regretted his words, holding up his hands. Wait, I didn't. You're going to need to make some hard decisions, Merrick, Loghain interrupted, his icy blue eyes narrowing. Ones you've been avoiding. You have an enemy to defeat. And while I may not know much about being a king, I do know what it takes to win a fight. The question is, do you want to win or not? And I think this is very much the conflict of the book. It's not, all these battles they're fighting. It's not this interpersonal conflict. It's whether or not Merrick is going to rule. And I don't just mean whether or not Merrick is going to be a king. I mean whether or not he's going to rule his country and be a leader that Ferelden really truly needs.
Even Catriel understands this because Loghain and her have a conversation earlier in the book, or Loghain's like, he is not ready to be king. He has a lot of growing and learning to make hard decisions left to do. And we're told that Catriel just nods. She knows that he will not survive. Merrick's fatal flaw, and his best quality as well, is that he always believes the good in people. He is very trusting. And I think that's what makes people like him, is that he looks at them and he sees the good and the potential in them. But at the same time, it leaves him open for betrayals like the one Catriel does, because Catriel does betray him. She gets regrets and she turns and she wants to do that. But she did betray him. She set out with the idea Arl Rendorn is dead because of her betrayal.
And not just Arl Rendorn, their other allies, half the army, they're dead because of her, because she killed them or she got people to kill them. And that's just the reality of it. We can't brush over her actions here.
I think it's one way you can look at this with Logain and him being cold and calculating and making sure Merrick makes the right decision. But he will not have a long reign if he sits with Catriol next to him, especially the families of those who died.
Yes, I don't think he would ever even be able to really ascend and have a coronation if he brought her along.
And not just because she's an elf.
Yes, because of what she's done. And not everybody knows, but I think enough people know that it would probably get out. But I think also, at the end of the day, Logain is basically after Merrick kills her violently, Logain is like, okay, you've got to stop beating yourself up. Like, what's done is done. This was justice. And Merrick is pissed off and he's like, justice, really? And Logain says, Logain nodded grimly. Justice that a king must dispense, whether it pleases him to or not. And he goes on to talk about his backstory and how his mom was raped and killed by the Orlesians and how his father fought them because of it. And that's why they're on the run, because, his father was now a criminal. And so all of this, Logain is telling to Merrick is like, hey, I've had to make hard choices. I know that this is not easy. Like, I'm here for you. I am your friend. I want what's best for you. Don't get in your feelings about this. And I think it's so poignant because it really illustrates the fact that even though they've been on the run for Merrick's whole life, Merrick has still been presented with the luxury of choice. Merrick has been presented with the luxury of not having to rule, whereas Logain has never had the luxury to not make the hard decision. Logain has always, since the Orlesian occupation, had to make the hard choices.
I definitely agree. This is the turning point for Merrick. This is the point where he really makes that final choice and becomes a king, which the next big plot point, I would say it's almost not quite as drastic of a turn of Anakin cutting off Mace Windu's hand, what he does to younglings.
Yes, I agree with that. But first, you're forgetting one major important thing, and it's that right after Merrick kills Catriel, Logain goes to Rowan and is basically like, you have to go back to Merrick. He just killed Catriel. I told him everything. You have to go be Ferelden's queen. And she's like, okay. And she goes. And that's kind of their reconciliation. And so that's a really important part of this too. But you're right. Right after that, Merrick goes and he confronts the 4 bands that betrayed his mother. And he presents it, him and Logain, as, hey, we want you to come back and be on our side because more and more people are flocking to the rebellion. It's growing. They're really going to be able to take down the Orlesians. And these 4 bands are like, no, we don't want to join you. What are you going to do? You can't kill us all. And then he does. He kills them all. And it's very bloody. It's very brutal. It is violent. It is murderous. And of course, I think it's understandable because he's looking into the eyes of the people that murdered his mom. Of course he's angry. Of course he wants his vigilante justice.
He does it in the chantry. I think it's Merrick sending a message of like, we're coming for Megrin. And those of you who want to stand with him are going to get his same fate.
But also, I think it's interesting because you said that it happens in the chantry. There's also a line in this chapter where Merrick says he feels like Mafarath. And I was just like, holy shit. Like the personality change starting in this chapter, I think it's chapter 18, is so stark.
Yes.
And this is the next to last chapter of the book. So yeah, he kills these bands. That's basically the end of that. And then the next day or a little bit later, I'm not sure exactly, the last chapter, the party is splitting up. Obviously, Catriel's dead, but Logain and Rowan are going to fight the Battle of Riverdane, where Logain will become a hero and he gets that title, Hero of Riverdane. Meanwhile, Merrick goes to kill Severin, Megrin's second in command, and also at the same time, Mother Bronock, who is Megrin's other advisor, has betrayed Megrin and declared that Merrick is the rightful ruler of Ferelden. And that's kind of how the book ends. We do have a little bit of an epilogue, but we don't get any more from the trio. The epilogue is focused on Mother Ilis has come back. Logain went and found her after the war, and she's with Caitlin. And they're talking about all of these stories, all these things that happened. And we learned that after 3 more years of war, Denerim fell to the rebels after a long siege. Megran was defeated and executed for his crimes against Ferelden, and Merrick was crowned king. And she concludes by revealing that Merrick has actually become quite a popular king. Logain has become a very powerful Terran of Gorin, and he married and he had a daughter. And finally, that Rowan is Kaelin's mother and that she has died after a long wasting illness. And that's the end of the book. Okay, well, let's talk about characters really quickly. So the main characters are Merrick, Logain, Rowan, Catriel, Rendorn, Severin, and Megran. And I listed some personality traits of all of them because I feel like it's important to have a little bit of a spotlight on these characters. So Merrick, I feel, is charming, earnest, genuine, unprepared, idealistic, trusting, talkative, dutiful, insecure, humorous, and positive. Okay, so I feel like Logain is the one where people might be mad at me a little bit, but Logain is suspicious, intuitive, brutal, pessimistic, willing to make the hard choices, especially when no one else is, and lastly, willing to ignore or overlook the truth, especially when he has already made up his mind on something.
I would definitely agree this. And the one thing that I would add to this is probably survivalistic, maybe if that's a word. And it comes down to Logain in this, that Logain at the end of the day is a survivor, and the betrayal he makes of people is to ensure his survival or the survival of what he is fighting for. And at the end of the day, Logain is loyal to 3 things: Merrick, Rowan, and Ferelden. And he...
Not necessarily in that order.
And once Merrick is dead and Rowan is dead, his only loyalty remains to Ferelden, which is sad because he is willing to throw away the son of a woman who he claimed to love. He is always looking for his own survival. I think especially when he feels betrayed. And Kaelin's correspondence with Celine would have been a really big betrayal for Logain, would have been a really big deal.
Yes, I completely agree with that. But also, I just want to, as we move on to Rowan, I just want to kind of emphasize the similarities between them. So, we've said that Logain is suspicious, intuitive, pessimistic. Rowan also is intuitive, suspicious, pessimistic, but hers manifests so differently. Whereas Logain is very much like, he just shuts down and is like, okay, I'm going to leave. Rowan is angry. She's pissed off. She will hit Merrick, like she slaps him in the book like twice. She's impatient. She has a red hot temper. And so they're very similar characters, but their character traits manifest just a little bit differently, I think. I think Catriel is very much described as seductive. Whether or not she actually intends to be is another conversation, but I think Gaider has written her intending for her to be a seductive character, but she's also cunning. She's also curious. She's also patient, kind of the opposite of Rowan in that respect. She has a lot of knowledge about history, culture, etc. And I think she's also wise in a sense, but I think a lot of her wisdom is affected. Like she's putting it on in order to appear more wise, especially when they're in the deep roads.
I think the wisdom in the deep roads is also a survival technique of like saying like, I'm trying to make myself necessary and needed in this journey so they don't abandon me.
All right, so moving on to Rendorn Garen. I think he's stoic. I think he's traditional, honorable, intelligent, and yet very set in his ways. I don't think anybody can argue with that if you've read this book.
No. If we're talking about successors into the game, like Eamon is definitely Rendorn's successor. Like they are like copy and paste of each other. But I think Tegan is more like Rowan.
Oh, I completely agree. And I was going to bring that up. But moving forward a little bit with Severin the Mage, I think he's very cunning. He's very sly. He is smart, but blinded by power, which we see several times him being susceptible to poisoning because he thinks that he can't be beaten. And I also think he's the literal definition of a Slytherin. Like everything good and bad with that.
He reminds me, so there's 2 points. I have a lot of comparisons to the Inheritance Cycle with this book. mainly that I think Logain and Merrick are Aragon and Murtagh. But I think
Merrick is Aragon and Logain is Murtagh.
yes, 100%. But Severin reminds me of the twins from Aragon.
Yeah, I see that too.
It's very rare that like a villain is introduced to me like in a book and I'm like, I immediately hate you. But Megran and Severin fit into that thing. Like from the first sentence that they're on the page, I'm like, I hate you.
Very much. And so then let's just skip on over to Megran, which is the last one. He is very clearly portrayed as like the stupidest, most idiotic, worst ruler ever. Like he's so self-centered. He's power hungry. He's brutal. He's murderous. He's sadistic. He's all of the worst traits that you could ever imagine put into one person. Okay, do you have anything else to add about these characters, or can we go into some analysis and lore discrepancies?
Let's talk about those lore discrepancies.
Okay. So, the first most important thing is timeline. The timeline on page 133 of the World of Thedas Encyclopedia, Volume 1, says that Prince Merrick defeated King Megran in 9-0 dragon. However, in the epilogue of this book, it says that their duel happened 3 years after the Battle of the River Dane, which took place in 899 Blessed Age. So that would put the end of the Orlesian occupation at 902 Dragon. So there's a little bit of discrepancy there on the dating of when Merrick actually comes to power. Another thing I want to talk about is Calabria is mentioned like 4 or 5 times in this book. And I had to Google this. I was like, what is Calabria? Like, I don't even know what this is. Well, apparently Calabria is Antiva's original name. And there's actually something else. I think it's on a map or something in Origins that still has Calabria on it too. So anytime they say Calabria in this book, they mean Antiva. Just number one. We've kind of already talked about Andraste. She was burned on the cross instead of the stake, which probably was just something they changed. And then the two bigger things that I wanted to point out are the role of women and the Orlesian language. So let's get into Orlesian language first. It happens in like page 181 or so when they're fighting some of the Chevalier. And it's talking about they're watching these Chevalier walk into Gorin and they're speaking Orlesian to each other. And so I had to go on some deep Googling. I was like, what? I've never heard of an Orlesian language. I've heard of Syrian language. I've heard of these kind of predecessors to Orlais, to Ferelden. Those tribes, they all had languages, sure. But an Orlesian language from when they were united? Do they not just have like a common tongue like we've seen portrayed in the games? Well, so anyway, my Googling paid off. And according to Cassandra, she says that, yes, there was an Orlesian language, but nobody speaks it anymore.
Okay.
I don't know what to say there. But these Chevalier are using it, so I don't know.
That's really weird. Also, I would guess that they changed the burning on the cross to the stake just to avoid having images of a burning cross in the game.
Yeah. And also, so they wouldn't piss off the Christians. Okay, so the last kind of like lore thing I want to bring up is the role of women. Because there are so many times in this book particularly that like Rowan is looked down upon because she's a woman and she's a warrior, where sexual assault happens like twice in this novel. There's a dwarven merchant who threatens Rowan with sexual assault and objectifies her. And there's a comment that David Gaider makes in the book about Rowan's broad shoulders. And just there's several times where I was like, is this not supposed to be set in a world that there is no sexism, which they've said before in game, like, oh, sexism doesn't exist in Thedas, whatever. But it does exist in this book. So there's that. I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Logan kind of hints at this in that he says, like, it's not uncommon for women to be warriors, but it would be uncommon for a noble woman to be a warrior. Just because of for lack of what Logan says, their value Like
Yeah.
a noble wouldn't risk their daughter's value by letting them be a warrior. But we also have notice of that, like, Orlais does have sexism because, like, there's the whole story of Aveline, the first Aveline, who Aveline in Dragon Age 2 is named after, and that she's killed because she wants to enter the Grand Tourney or be a chevalier, and she's a woman. But I do agree there is some consistency, and we've talked about that on the podcast before of, like, what is it? Is there actually equal status, or are you just saying that so people won't be like, oh, I'm going to play as a boy? You want people to play as women in the game.
Yeah. Again, we've talked about this extensively on the podcast, so I don't want to spend too much longer on it. But I honestly think it's just the writers were trying to do something different, and like sexism in their own minds unintentionally got into the lore, and we just have to deal with that.
I think I would agree with that.
Okay, so I want to move on. This is the kind of final section of the episode, which is our ratings. Did we like or dislike this book? So Austin and I have rubrics that I created that kind of breaks it down into 5 different categories: plot, characters, prose, dialogue, and then like world building, lore accuracy. And so we can rate it on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is obviously like abysmal, horrible. Every lore point is wrong. All of the dialogue is cringy. Think Attack of the Clones. Like, the characters are not memorable. The plot is the same as anything else, right? And then 5s are obviously everything is so unique. Everyone's fully formed. Everything's perfect. Like, great writing, great prose, great dialogue, new ideas, no lore inconsistencies, all of that. So there's a total of 25 points available. And so I just thought we could kind of give our final rating, our total scores, and then what we rated each individual category. So do you want to do yours first?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So plot, I gave it a 4. I don't think it's the most unique plot ever. I mean, it's a typical rebellion, like upstart, grassroots rebellion movement that overthrows a greater power. It's literally the hero's journey. But it does offer some unique stuff in there. I think the characterization of Logain and Merrick and their story going in there is a great point in there. So I gave it a 4. Characters, I gave a 3. I think they do resemble other characters. I think they fall into these archetypes, but I also found them engaging. Like, I loved reading about Merrick. I loved reading about Logain. I loved all of that. I liked their interactions. They felt real to me. So I think that at least deserves a 3. Pros, I also gave a 3 just because it's not my favorite. I recognize that, like, I don't really think there's anything like wrong with it. I just didn't enjoy reading through David Gaider's prose. So I gave that a 3. I do think the greatest strength in this is the dialogue, in that it's not unimmersive. Like, it doesn't break my immersion into the book, which I think is something that authors can struggle with. I read a lot of Star Wars books, and those dialogue moments can break your immersion in there, because you're like, okay, it doesn't feel real. Everything in here feels very real, and there's a lot of passion and drama that's done through the dialogue, and I like that. I also like when lore is dumped through a dialogue, and there's a lot of that in here, just because I like when lore is explained in a conversation versus like, let me read a paragraph of prose about this. And then world building, I gave 3, just because there are some like lore contradictions. He kind of like rushes for me a little bit through like explaining the lore, and like, we know that magic exists, but we don't get a lot of explanation of what magic is. And to be fair, it's not a focus of this book. Like, there aren't a lot of mages in this book, but it's still, for something to be a prevalent part of Thedas and not be explained. Like, we're barely explained even what a circle is, even though we go to one. Yeah. And so I had a total of 19 out of 25, which is a 3.8.
So we have very similar scores right off the bat. I gave the plot a 3. I felt like it was very predictable. And I felt like ultimately there are sections that definitely stand out: the very beginning, the very end, when they're in the deep roads. But everything else for me completely blends together. And like I said earlier, it was hard the first time I read this for me to keep the battle straight, for me to keep separate like what was happening and when it was happening. So for that reason, I gave it a 3. I gave the characters a 3.5 because I do feel like the characters are what makes this book good. If like the characters were terrible and the plot was mid, like it would not be a good book. But I do think that this is a good book, and I think the heart of this novel is Merrick's relationships with Rowan and Logain, specifically Logain. And so I think the relationship between the two of them is very well done. And so while I may have originally thought, yeah, maybe we'll do a 3 for the characters, I had bumped it up to a 3.5 just because of the relationship between Merrick and Logain. For the prose, I really agreed with you on the 3. I think that it left something to be desired. There are many times where action happened to Merrick rather than Merrick doing things. And then with dialogue, I completely agreed with you. Dialogue is the number one best part of this. David Gaider excels at writing dialogue, easily the best technical part of this novel. And then lastly, the world building and lore accuracy, I gave a 3, even though I thought about giving it a 2, but I felt like at the end of the day, the lore discrepancies, the lore inaccuracies are pretty minor. They're not major, like, world-shattering revelations. They're just little errors. So I didn't feel like it was fair to give it anything less than a 3. So that puts my total score to 17.5, which gives me a final rating of 3.5.
I did not know we could do 0.5s, half ratings in the thing.
Sorry.
So I would have probably given characters again a 3.5 with you. Anything else you want to add?
I think I would just say that I liked this book. I like it a lot. I think it's probably my favorite of the David Gaider novels. And at the same time, there are some things I don't like about it. And there are some things that leave a lot to be desired. Particularly, the biggest complaint I have is by the end of the novel, the 2 male main characters are alive and thriving, and the 2 female main characters are dead. And one of those female characters was murdered by her love interest, and the other one got the Padme treatment. So to me, it was very, very out of character ending for Rowan, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And I think one other thing is like pacing of this book, I think is a problem. Just in general, I don't know if that goes in with prose, probably. And just like I said, like so much happens in the last 100 pages, but we also skip a lot. Like we skip 3 years that we don't get to see anything. Like we don't get to see Merrick defeat Megran. There's we have no scenes of Merrick and Megran together, which leaves a lot to be desired.
And we never get to see why Logain gets the title of Hero of the River Dane.
I remember when I was coming up with this, I was like, I only got like 40 pages left in this book. Are they really going to do all of this in 40 pages? I was like, well, maybe there will be explanation in the epilogue. And there was, but
not really.
No.
But overall, I think it sounds like we did like this book and had a few things we wished were done differently.
Yes, definitely. Which I have a feeling is going to be my feeling about The Calling as well. But with that, we can wrap it up. So thank you for organizing this and getting through this. It was a great book. Thank you all for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Hi, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Ariel.
And we're the hosts of the Legend of Zelda Lorecast, podcast about all things Legend of Zelda, from Errol to Zora,
and all the fun things in between.
If you're ready to dive deep and learn more about the Legend of Zelda lore and everything surrounding it, come join us on the Legend of Zelda Lorecast. You can find us on Apple iTunes, Spotify, Google, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
We hope to see you soon.